There was a time when Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor believed he could outrun the past, that the walls around him were too thick, the system too loyal, and the truth too fragmented to ever catch him. But those walls are collapsing in real time. Three powerful forces, the police, US lawmakers, and his own family, are closing in from different directions, each uncovering a piece of a puzzle he spent years trying to bury. And what's emerging now threatens not just his reputation, but the very freedom he took for granted. What's unfolding around him isn't a slow scandal or a fading controversy, it's a coordinated reckoning from every angle. New evidence is surfacing, pressure is building behind closed doors, and decisions are being made inside the family that he never believed they would take. And the deeper investigators dig, the clearer it becomes that this story is far from over, and the final twist may be the one nobody saw coming. If you want to stay ahead of every revelation as it breaks and follow the truth through the parts the headlines never fully explain, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. What's coming next could reshape everything you thought you knew. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor once lived inside a world where his name alone could open doors, silence questions, and shield him from consequences. But that world has vanished, and what's left is a man stripped down to nothing but the decisions he made and the secrets he hoped would never resurface. Losing his status wasn't just symbolic, it was the moment everyone around him realized the shield had cracked. And behind that crack was stories the family had kept buried for years, stories that are now rising to the surface faster than anyone expected. But the loss of identity was just the first blow. Being forced out of the residence he called home for nearly 2 decades marked the point where even quiet loyalty inside the family began to fade. People close to the situation say this wasn't a gentle removal, it was a message that something much larger was unfolding, and that distancing him wasn't optional anymore. What exactly sparked that sudden shift? Insiders hint it wasn't just public pressure, but something far more damaging found in documents no one was supposed to see. What truly unsettled those watching wasn't the eviction or the loss of privilege, it was the sudden fear that he might try to escape the country altogether. That fear didn't come out of nowhere. Behind palace walls, whispers started circulating that he was becoming unpredictable, more isolated, and more aware of how quickly things were closing in on him. And when someone who once relied on power suddenly realizes they don't have any left, the next move is always the most dangerous one. But what exactly were insiders afraid he would do? The answer lies in what investigators uncovered next. Because the moment talk began about seizing his passport, it became clear the situation wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially explosive. People familiar with the decision said it wasn't about punishment, but prevention. Prevention of a move that would mirror what another troubled royal once did when cornered. And that comparison alone hints at a level of panic inside the institution they refuse to acknowledge publicly. But that's not the most surprising part. The real turning point came from a set of documents few people outside a small circle even knew existed. Those documents would reveal why pressure around him suddenly intensified, and why some believe the full truth hasn't even been touched yet. The push to take his passport didn't just appear out of thin air. It came from a growing belief among insiders that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor might try to pull a move that's been done before by another disgraced royal. When pressure became unbearable, Spain's former king quietly vanished into the Middle East, leaving investigators scrambling to catch up. And the uncomfortable truth is that Andrew's connections in that region run deeper than most people realize. Deep enough that some insiders fear he already has an escape route planned. But what exactly triggered that fear? The answer lies in what investigators stumbled onto next. Because behind the scenes, lawmakers reviewing Epstein's estate found internal emails that didn't match Andrew's public timeline. Messages suggesting his involvement went far beyond what he ever acknowledged.
These weren't dramatic confessions, but subtle phrases, quiet exchanges, and patterns of communication that painted a very different picture. And when those contradictions started stacking up, the question became unavoidable. If his story wasn't accurate about the past, what else had he been hiding? That's when attention shifted to a set of documents nobody expected to see. Those documents revealed something far more concerning. Signals that certain individuals within the estate believed he might try to leave the UK before being questioned. That suggestion, coming from the very people sorting the estate's internal communications, sent a chill through people monitoring the case. They weren't making guesses, they were basing their fears on something in the emails, something they haven't publicly released yet. So what could be inside those undisclosed exchanges that made them think he might run? And that's where the comparisons to Juan Carlos stopped being hypothetical and started feeling like a roadmap. A high-profile royal under extreme scrutiny, quietly boarding a plane before officials even realized he was gone. For the first time, people inside government circles began asking whether the same scenario could happen again, and whether the only way to prevent it was to take away Andrew's passport altogether. But the urgency didn't come from international parallels alone. It came from something else investigators discovered that completely changed the tone of the discussions. Because when US officials realized certain emails implied continued contact long after Andrew claimed he cut ties, they started pressing harder. Hard enough that UK insiders began to worry about how far American lawmakers might push this, and what could happen if Andrew was still able to travel freely. That's the moment everything shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just about rumors, it was about potential evidence, and what would happen if the man at the center of it simply boarded a plane and never returned. But even that wasn't the most alarming development. The real shock came from what British investigators found when they looked back at something that happened years earlier, something connected to the very people meant to protect him.
When British investigators reopened the files connected to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's former protection officers, it wasn't treated as a routine review. It was treated as a potential abuse of power. The allegation at the center of it all was unsettling, claims that he passed along the personal details of the woman who accused him and asked a protection officer to dig into her background. For years, this allegation sat on the fringes of the story, whispered but never fully examined. Now, for the first time, detectives were pulling phone logs, old notebooks, and archived emails to see how far those requests actually went. And early findings suggested far more than a simple lapse in judgment. Because the moment investigators realized those officers may have shared information with each other about the request, the case shifted from rumor to something that needed answers. 2 officers were quietly questioned, and people close to the process said their testimonies didn't line up perfectly. One described the request as unusual, the other as improper, and both hinted there might have been conversations that never made it into the official logs. If those conversations existed, they could show exactly how much influence Andrew tried to exert behind closed doors. But what investigators truly wanted to know was this: was he acting alone, or was someone advising him on what to ask? As more documents were reviewed, questions began forming that no one in the family wanted aired publicly. Who else knew about the request? Was this the only incident, or were there others buried in years of routine protection logs? And if there were, what would that reveal about how he reacted once the accusations became public? Those possibilities forced detectives to widen their scope, because patterns of behavior matter, especially when power and influence mix with personal fear. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about an old request. It was about something much bigger. What truly alarmed people inside the institution wasn't simply that he might have crossed a line. It was the realization that he may have believed he could. That belief that he could use state-funded protection officers to shield himself hinted at a mindset that investigators found deeply concerning. And once that possibility was acknowledged, the question shifted from "did he do it?" to "how often did he think he could?"
That's when the investigation suddenly turned from a narrow inquiry into a broader review of how much leverage he had silently exercised for years. And the more they uncovered, the more obvious it became that the fallout wasn't going to stop with police interviews. Because while detectives focused on the past, the family was focused on the present, and what they were discovering through their own channels made them rethink everything. For the first time, people close to them began questioning whether keeping him inside the fold was even possible anymore, not because of public pressure, but because of what the internal findings suggested about the choices he made when he thought no one was watching. And that realization forced the family to consider a move they had avoided for as long as they could.
When the family finally made their move, it wasn't announced with fanfare or ceremony. It happened quietly, behind closed doors, where the real decisions are always made. One moment, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor still carried the remnants of a royal identity. The next, he was told those remnants no longer existed. Every honor, every symbol, every title he once believed was permanent was removed. What shocked insiders wasn't the decision itself, but how abruptly it happened. And according to people close to the situation, the swiftness hinted at something the family discovered, something they believed left them no choice. Losing the residence was the second blow, and it landed harder than many expected. Royal Lodge wasn't just a home, it was the last place where he still felt connected to the world he once ruled over. Being forced to leave wasn't simply a relocation, it was the institution's way of saying they were done shielding him. Even those who once defended him admitted that the decision was more than symbolic. So what changed behind the scenes that made them cut ties so cleanly? Some believed it wasn't just public pressure, but internal updates on ongoing investigations they weren't willing to overlook. And the fallout didn't stop with him. Those connected to him felt the ripple effects too. People who expected to remain untouched by the consequences suddenly found their own associations with him questioned. His former partner, who once shared part of that public identity, saw her own title quietly vanish in the aftermath. For the first time, it became clear this was no longer about protecting the image of one individual. It was about protecting the image of the entire institution. But what exactly were they trying to distance themselves from so urgently? Inside palace circles, the shift was described as total separation, a phrase not used lightly. The message was unmistakable. They weren't building a path for him to return, they were closing every door behind him. And people familiar with the decision said there was something coldly strategic about the timing, as if the family knew what was coming next and wanted no part of it. That's what raised the most questions. What did they anticipate? What were they preparing for? And why were they so certain they needed to move before the next wave of revelations hit? Because the more distance they created, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about punishment, it was about survival, theirs, not his. And once that intent became visible, speculation inside media circles grew louder. Had the family seen documents or heard testimony that hasn't been made public? Were they bracing for another development the public hasn't been warned about yet?
If you want to stay ahead of every new detail as it emerges, the hidden documents, the private decisions, and the moments that could reshape everything, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. What comes next could be the turning point the world has been waiting for, and you won't want to miss a single part of what happens next.